last 70 years, movies based off DC Comics have been hitting theaters. Some of them are awesome, and some of them are awful. Well, today we're gonna stop and rank all 45 theatrically released DC films from the worst to the best. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comments section. If you're up for the challenge, go ahead and show me your ranking of every DC movie that you've seen. The full list of movies is down below in the description. Also, if you don't know, I previously ranked all 58 Marvel movies back when Endgame came out. If you enjoyed this video and want more like it, you can check that one out right up here when this video is over. And let's get started. In last place, Justice League 2017. Now, when this movie first came out, I appreciated finally getting to see the Justice League all together on the big screen. But at the same time, it felt like a movie that had been directed by committee, processed to death, and filled with some of the most obvious reshoots I had ever seen. But over the last 4 years, and with the release of Zack Snyder's Justice League, it's become incredibly clear that this movie was a cynical attempt to turn Zack Snyder's movie into something completely different. And the grossest part about the whole thing is that they used the death of his daughter as an opportunity to pervert his vision into something completely different.
Not impressed.
Joss Whedon's style and skill set is absolutely not compatible with Zack Snyder's, so he was always a terrible pick for a replacement. But from there, they mandated to him that he take this 3+ hour movie and squeeze it into a runtime under 2 hours while adding in a bunch of stupid jokes. And so this was always a bad assignment, but this is also very far from his best work, and based off of all accounts, his behavior on set was totally unacceptable. This is a bit like reading the Cliff Notes version of a great story, except every page has been written by a different person and it has a bunch of really bad jokes thrown into the mix. It's a bad sign when the credited director and virtually all of the cast publicly diss the movie that was released, and no one will defend the actual director and producers that finished the film. When I look at this movie, I simply see an abomination and some of the worst examples of how Hollywood can go horribly wrong, so it comes in last place. Number 44, Jonah Hex, one of the most shockingly bad films for a major studio to have put out within the last 15 years. But it's not so bad that it loops back around and becomes good. It's not so bad that it's funny and amusing. It's so bad, it's boring.
That's awful. Just awful.
The plot is both overly simplistic and largely incomprehensible. There's not a whole lot going on here. The runtime with credits is only 81 minutes, but absolutely nothing is explained. Why can Jonah Hex talk to dead people? What are these magic balls that can blow up cities? Why is Megan Fox infatuated with a hideously deformed man twice her age? For that matter, why is Megan Fox in this movie? When it comes to both the flow of the entire story as well as individual scenes, everything feels chopped to pieces like we're watching a heavily abridged version of a larger story. It's also a movie that was clearly written to be rated R. It's from the writers of Crank, and then they converted it into a PG-13 movie. So it has all these scenes that set up sex, violence, torture, profanity, and then right as you're about to get to the sex, violence, torture, and profanity, it cuts away. So every time something awesome's about to happen, you don't get to see it. This is a big studio picture with a bunch of A-listers. There is simply no excuse for how choppy and sloppy this movie turned out, and it's not even worth checking out to see how bad it is. Next up, Supergirl. Now I gotta say, the score for this movie, it's actually really good. Helen Slater, not bad casting. Everything else about this movie is a painful, charmless, incoherent train wreck. Supergirl flies down to Earth in order to find an object with her city needs in order to survive. It's life or death stuff. As soon as she gets to Earth, She flies around for 15 minutes, then she sees humans playing sports and decides to enroll in college and join the sports team, in which then it turns into Revenge of the Nerds for about 15 minutes of screen time. There's no explanation given as to why suddenly her education trumps saving the people of her city.
You serious?
It's like the screenwriter for Supergirl and the screenwriter for a new Revenge of the Nerds movie were walking down a hallway, they dropped their scripts, the pages got mixed up together, and they just went, let's just go with it. From there, we get a plot line about a witch who's angry at Supergirl over a love spell going wrong. As dumb as all that sounds, it's even dumber with the execution, and the dialogue is even worse.
Without it, this city can't survive more than a few days.
Our lights will grow dim and the very air we breathe so thin.
It's a movie so bad that they cast legendary actor Peter O'Toole only to have him walking around the Phantom Zone saying squirt.
Squirt. Squirt.
At the end of the day, I'm an 80s kid. I grew up on the Salkind produced Superman properties. I have a ton of nostalgia for these films, but I find this movie tedious to sit through as an adult. Number 42, Steel, the first of several movies on this list where they decided to convert a DC character closely tied to an A-list hero, only to never mention the A-list hero and rewrite the backstory to exclude the actual property that we care about. Now, this is a movie that I've avoided watching for over 20 years ago. I watched it for the very first time about 6 weeks ago, and it was just as bad as its reputation. To state the obvious, Shaq is not a great thespian, or a good thespian, or even a halfway decent one. He's a 7-foot-tall plank of wood that exudes zero charisma in this movie.
This guy's really good.
The main villain from Judd Nelson is a total over-the-top live-action cartoon character who just kills people left and right in exotic ways. Annabelle Gish's character is a blatant ripoff of Barbara Gordon's Oracle from the comics. Really, the whole thing is cartoonishly goofy. For the most part, it's just so bad it's boring, but it does have moments of so bad it's good, especially as you move into the finale and you see Annabelle Gish's character spinning around in a wheelchair shooting lasers at people. Then Steel defeats the villain with reverse psychology. The costumes are pretty hilarious, but in general, this is a movie. It's harmless, it's not offensive. Then we have Superman and the Mole Men. I feel a little bit bad having to include this movie in the bottom 15. This was the very first movie theatrically released based off of a DC property. It actually turns 70 this November, so it's an important piece of history for the comic book movie genre. But at only 58 minutes and being produced on a shoestring budget such a long time ago, it feels like it barely qualifies as a movie. It feels way more like just an extended episode of the old TV show. Plays a lot more like a 1950s creature feature than it does a Superman story. It takes place 2,500 miles away from Metropolis, involves these creatures from the ground showing up in this town, invading them with toxic waste and a mob forming to try and take the creatures out. Superman has to show up to save the day. There's not very much action, and when it does take place, it's very minor. Superman could have resolved all of this much earlier in the story had he done different things, but the script requires him not to do those things so the story can take place, and unfortunately, it's simply not a movie that's aged well because of the constraints under which it was created such a long time ago. So while it might be an important piece of history for the comic book movie genre, that doesn't make it good. Kicking off the top 20, The Kitchen. This 2019 film is based off a DC Vertigo limited series and thus technically qualifies to be on this list. The movie seems to think that it's Scarface with women, but it's really not. The problem is none of these women feel like real humans with consistent personalities or motivations. One day, they're passive housewives. The next, they decide to be mob enforcers. And it just happens. No transition, no setbacks. They just very quickly turn into these people that are offering protection and collecting money from people. And beyond that, like, we know why they start doing this, why they break bad, but we don't really know why they so quickly transition into sociopaths. The movie just feels like it's rushing through plot points. When little Jackie, the main antagonist of the first third of the movie, attacks Walsh, it doesn't pause to build any tension, make you afraid. It just very quickly kills him off, introduces a new character, and moves on without processing what just happened or the fact that this is very important for the story as a whole. All of that would make for a dull and bad movie, which it is, but technically speaking, this is a more proficiently made film with more coherent storytelling than a lot of the other films here in the bottom 15. What really pushes this movie so far down on the list is its entirely ill-conceived central concept. The movie tries to tell this story about these three housewives turning into sociopaths as a tale of female empowerment.
Not a great plan.
Multiple times in the movie, it attempts to justify the horrific actions of these women because of sexism. If you want to tell a tale about housewives turning into violent criminals, that can be interesting, though this isn't. But if you want to try and explain how murder is a valid expression of female liberation, we have a problem. Moving along, we have the return of Swamp Thing. 7 years after horror legend Wes Craven's original Swamp Thing, it got a sequel. Only this time it plays with the tone of a screwball comedy, minus all of the jokes. It has this wacky tone. All the side characters are over the top Southern stereotypes with wacky accents. But none of it actually makes you laugh. It's just goofiness for goofiness' sake. The main plot involves Heather Locklear investigating her evil stepfather and his evil experiments, which means that Swamp Thing is kind of a secondary character in his own movie. No one in the film acts like an actual human. They don't have proper responses. Like when Heather Locklear first meets Swamp Thing, she doesn't seem at all surprised to have a walking and talking plant right in front of her.
You're a plant, aren't you?
Oh yeah, and the movie features a PG-13 fantasy sex scene between Heather Locklear and Swampy. That last sentence might sound random and out of nowhere until you realize this movie was directed by Jim Wynorski, who prior to this worked on several Roger Corman films. After this, spent the 90s directing a bunch of erotic thrillers, and then for the last 20 years, he's directed such porn parody classics as The Bear Witch Project and Para-Knockers Activity. So you know you're probably in for something classy with this one. Number 38, Catwoman. Of all the obvious paths to take a Catwoman movie, how do you choose this? Do you want a complex character associated with Batman, a cat burglar but with a decent heart, constantly torn between good and bad? Nah. Why not throw out all Catwoman lore and instead tell the story of an artist killed by an evil makeup company, but brought back to life by an Egyptian cat in order to battle the evil makeup saleswoman who's gained superpowers by using too much makeup? What?
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
Oh yeah, not only did Catwoman become a superhero because of the Egyptian cat, she also got some sick skills on the basketball court. This is a shockingly bad idea for a movie, executed just as bad. The hand-to-hand fight sequences are filled with CGI rather than stunt work. All of the direction is over the top. The entire plot is held together by a bunch of coincidences where she just happens to show up when a bank heist is taking place. She just happens to be an amusement park ride that malfunctions. Now, to be fair, this one does have a good bit of so bad it's good potential. It is energetically bad. It misses the mark by so much, it hits a different target. Comedy. Next up, Batman and Robin. Whereas many of the films in the bottom 15 are here because of production troubles or budget issues, with Batman and Robin, I think they made the movie they set out to make. Unfortunately, no one else wanted to see that film. After going camp with Batman Forever, Joel Schumacher decided to crank the camp sliders up to 11 with this film and go full-blown live-action cartoon. From the terrible bat jokes,
7 million. Never leave the cave without it.
to the unforgivable versions of characters, to its attempt to be the punniest movie of all time.
I want us to be together, but I want to make sure you're serious about turning over a new leaf.
Hey, freeze.
The heat is on.
Let's get some ice.
Everything in this movie is either a total miscalculation or poorly executed. It's even tough to know who this movie was designed for because it's way too goofy for adults.
Louder, come on, sing!
But it has way too many butt, boob, nipple, and crotch shots to think it was designed for children. By this point in time, it's been long acknowledged that this movie was made to sell toys.
First movie, things felt much sharper. The second one, I felt like I was making a toy commercial.
The merchandising and licensing became a very, very important part of the making of the film, and I went along with it.
And the end result is one of the biggest blockbuster misfires of all time. But for me, an entertaining, very bad film.
Didn't you apologize to the crowd at Comic-Con for Batman and Robin? I always apologize for Batman.
If I disappointed them in any way, then I really want to apologize, because it wasn't my intention. My intention was just to entertain them.
Coming in at number 36, Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. After Superman 3, Canon bought the rights to the Superman franchise, and they wanted to return to the vibe of the first two films. Unfortunately, they didn't have the money to pull it off, so they had to cut corners everywhere to try and make this film, and nowhere is this more apparent than the fact that they reused the same shot of Superman flying all throughout the entire film. Beyond that, the plotting is absolutely horrendous. For the first 15 minutes of the film, things are just happening that are supposed to happen in a Superman movie, with him rescuing people and visiting the Kent farm, but none of it actually ties into the main plot of the film, and it's tough to know if this is due to the script, the production, or the movie being killed in the editing room. It's well known that as much as 45 minutes of this film, or a third of its runtime, were cut during the editing process. And this means a bunch of events happen in the movie that aren't set up. We just see them take place. Other times we see reactions to events that weren't shown at all. During one sequence, we see Clark a little bit sick. Then we see him suddenly at the Kent farm and his hair's falling out of his head. And then in the next scene, he's got a full head of hair and he's healthy again without explaining anything, any of what just took place. The sad part is that this was Reeves' last time playing the part, and he really wanted to make this a good film.
We're playing out the fantasy of what if there really were this person who could show up and end one of the greatest problems of our time, which is the nuclear race. And if we get it right, which I think we're doing, this will be the best of the Superman movies. And that's not just a pep talk, I think it really will be.
And unfortunately, they simply weren't able to execute at the heights of his ambitions. But because this movie is trying to copy the first two Superman films, I find this to be a very watchable, bad movie. It's not good, but I can get enjoyment out of it. The Then we have Superman 3, a film that works better as an 80s comedy than it does as a Superman film. Whether you're talking about the fact that they decided to focus the film on Richard Pryor, or that it opens with this slapstick sequence with a Mr. Magoo type character, very clearly the producers and the director did not understand the Superman character and weren't very interested in telling a Superman story. Beyond that, it's a movie that it spends the entire first half of the film going on rabbit trails and setting everything up, so the main plot line doesn't kick in until about 60% of the way through the film. That's where you get the evil Superman and where they build the evil computer. As just a movie, this is a better made film than Superman 4: The Quest for Peace, but as a Superman story, Superman 4 clearly understood the character better than the people that made Superman 3. But I don't think that anyone was particularly happy with how things turned out. Christopher Reees very publicly criticized the way this movie turned out.
I had not been really thrilled with the way Superman 3 worked out. And don't need to say anything more, except sometimes things work, sometimes they don't.
And he made Superman 4 as an attempt to try and set things right. Unfortunately, that didn't play out very well. Number 34, Suicide Squad, another victim of how poorly run the WB was in the early stages of the DCEU. It's well known that they announced the release date for Suicide Squad before they had a finished script. This meant that director-screenwriter David Ayer only had 6 weeks to write the shooting script for the movie. Then in early 2016, when Deadpool got rave reviews and Batman v Superman got very lukewarm reviews, the WB got cold feet about Ayer's darker tone and wanted it to be funnier like Deadpool, so they commissioned a whole bunch of reshoots. They brought in the people that had cut a more fun trailer and reworked his entire film, both re-editing it, removing much of the score that he had for the film and replacing it with pop songs, and putting out this Frankenstein's monster that was one part David Ayer, one part trailer company, and a whole bunch of executives micromanaging. Ever since the announcement of the Snyder Cut, writer-director David Ayer has been very vocal about the fact that the movie that was released is not his version of the film, that everything was rearranged, the ending entirely redone, the involvement of Jared Leto as the Joker radically changed and transformed, and his movie was entirely score-based and didn't use any pop music as character development. And as of right now, WB doesn't seem to have any plans to release his version of the film, and I think that's unfortunate. To the movie's credit, the cast and characterizations are quite good. There's a bunch of chemistry amongst the squad, but the story and storytelling are just a total mess. The first 20 minutes of the movie is just character introductions. The first action sequence isn't for an hour into the film. It's difficult to even follow what's going on because it's cutting between so many different things, going back and forth, introducing information at very strange points in time. And it's tough to even know who do you blame when there's only 6 weeks to write the script and then the movie was entirely reworked in post-production. The one person you know who screwed this up were the executives who didn't take the time to do it right. There is some positives in here. It did make me want another Suicide Squad movie, but unfortunately the film we got is kind of a mess. Moving along to Red 2, and this is probably the least interesting and most forgettable film in the bottom 15. It's a mixed bag of a little bit of fun, a bunch of stale jokes, and some good enough action. I enjoyed the first Red enough, but I never even bothered to watch Red 2 until I was prepping this video, and then I watched it and I went, okay, that was essentially exactly what I was expecting. The first Red was a fun but forgettable film, and the second one is a slightly less fun and even more forgettable film. The plot is way too convoluted. There's way too many things taking place, so there's no possible way to make sense of why any one person is doing any one thing at any given moment, besides the fact that the plot requires it in order to get to the next action sequence or joke set up. But these movies exist for the sole purpose of showing this batch of actors having a bunch of fun on screen together, and I suppose it's good enough at doing that. It's not a movie that I would actively decide for no particular reason to rewatch. If I'm in the mood for a movie like this, there's a whole bunch of other movies I would pick before I'd go with this one, but if I had to watch it again, I wouldn't mind either. It's just kind of there. Coming in at number 32, Green Lantern, a dull and forgettable superhero movie, but one that I don't think is nearly as bad as its reputation. It's more disappointing than disaster for me. Now, the movie takes way too long to get going. It's 40 minutes before we get to Orr. It's over an hour before the very first Green Lantern superhero action sequence, and the movie in general has very little Green Lantern action, and once we get to the third act climax, he's battling a cloud? And there's no way around this. The CGI costume looks terrible. Seemed like they picked a villain that was too big for the story they wanted to tell. The first two acts of the movie make it clear that Parallax poses this existential threat to the Lantern Corps, and he's just wiping out top lanterns left and right. They're afraid they're gonna have to make a yellow ring in order to defeat him, and then this brand new Lantern is able to defeat him all by himself. Like, it just doesn't add up quite right. It's a real shame because Martin Campbell is a great director. I actually think Ryan Reynolds is good in the movie, and he has great on-screen chemistry with Blake Lively. And apparently they had great chemistry behind the scenes too, because they got married and brought multiple children into the world. But the movie as a whole doesn't work all that well. Apparently there was a lot of trouble behind the scenes, both in trying to get the script together, and then Campbell and Reynolds didn't see eye to eye on things, and I think you see that on screen. But to be clear, I don't think this movie is the total disaster that some people make it out to be. It's just a big letdown. Oh yeah, and Taika Waititi's in it. Closing out the bottom 15 is Wonder Woman 1984. Now, when I first saw this movie in the theater, I think I saw it with a little bit of rosy-colored glasses because, hey, it was the end of 2020, and I was just excited to see a big blockbuster comic book movie on the big screen. But even when I first watched it, a bunch of things with it didn't quite sit right with me. And it's a movie that's tough for me to kind of score because I think it does have some high highs and a bunch of really big problems. On the positive side, it's a movie that has fun taking advantage of its 80s time frame without overly relying on pop culture. It's also a movie that gives both the heroes and the villains character arcs where they have clear things that they want, the characters make choices, and those choices have consequences for the character as well as the plot. But the movie keeps swinging for the fences, and it strikes out way more than it knocks it out of the park. But in order to pull together all of these big plot threads into a single story, it has to compromise its logic, consistency, and continuity far too often. There's just so many little details that skirt credibility. Like, I know I'm watching a movie about an Amazonian goddess with a magic lasso, but you have to have some rules that govern your universe. There has to be some logic for how things work. Otherwise, you're constantly pulling me out of the movie as I'm going like, hey, wait a minute. How did that work? And that's the frustration. In order to achieve its lofty ambitions, it came at the cost at a consistent set of rules and logic, and that just cheapens the payoff of the film. It does have some great moments, but I can't overlook its faults simply because I respect its ambitions. Kicking off the top 30 is Batman Forever, the first Batman film directed by Joel Schumacher. I think improves upon a couple of the weaknesses of the Tim Burton Batman films, but makes a bunch of mistakes of its own. On the positive side, the movie actually focuses in on Bruce Wayne as the central character and does some interesting exploration of the psychology of Bruce and Dick Grayson. There's similarities and their differences, and it can get overlooked a little bit because the movie is so campy in tone. There is a good bit of action and some of it is well done. But of course, the Joel Schumacher Batman films are infamous for how campy they are. Certainly this one isn't as bad as Batman and Robin, but right off the bat, this movie kicks off with a joke about Batman getting drive-through.
Can I persuade you to take a sandwich with you, sir?
I'll get drive-through. And some ideas were so bad that Batman the Animated Series actually made fun of this movie in an episode.
Hey, who's talking about Batman? I love Batman. All those muscles, the tight rubber armor, and that flashy car. I heard it can drive up walls.
Yeah, sure, Joel.
But honestly, while the campiness hasn't aged all that well, that's not why the movie is this far down on the list. The storytelling here is very choppy. During the midsection in one sequence, you'll see Two-Face and Riddler doing a crime spree. The next scene is Dick Grayson randomly finding the Batcave, and then suddenly Nigmatech is become this major corporation in Gotham, and it's just like a series of things happening with no setup or natural connection between them, and the sequences could happen in any particular order. And then in the middle of the film, Bruce Wayne decides to stop being Batman while there's a crisis involving two different supervillains, and the movie doesn't fully explain why he becomes Batman again, as if a subplot had been removed. Because a subplot was removed. The DVD and Blu-ray have a bunch of deleted scenes of this subplot, and there's rumors of a much darker 3-hour cut of the film. And given how choppy the storytelling is here, I'm not surprised by that at all. When you put it all together, it's much better than Batman and Robin, but because they decided to cut out all the drama and serious stuff and just focus on the goofiness, it feels like a very dated product of its time. Number 29, Batman 66. After the wildly successful debut of the 1960s TV show, they decided to do a theatrical film where Batman faces all of his main rogues gallery. And it is exactly what you'd expect. A very campy version of Batman with puns, slapstick, and goofy riddles. The two standout sequences are the beginning one where Batman has a shark caught on his leg and the part later in the movie where he's trying to get rid of a bomb.
Some days you just can't get rid of a bomb.
Your ability to enjoy this movie is tied directly to either how much you enjoy puns or whether you grew up watching the 1960s TV show. If you grew up on The Dark Knight, you will be baffled by this film. As for me, I grew up watching reruns of the old show on Nick at Night. I have a ton of nostalgia for this movie, which I had on VHS, as well as that TV show. It's not amazing cinema. It is just a feature-length version of the TV show, but it does what it's going for relatively well. Granted, what it's going for feels ancient in the year 2021. Next up, Swamp Thing. Now, this is a movie I watched for the very first time while prepping this video, but because I spent so long prepping this video, I've actually watched it twice at this point in time. Now, this is a movie that's enjoyable largely for the novelty of seeing a superhero story through the lens of legendary horror director Wes Craven. It's very much an old-fashioned creature feature with people in rubber suits, kind of goofy, campy action sequences while taking itself very seriously. And there's something charming about this type of story if you're into kind of older monster movies and that kind of thing. Some of the storytelling here I think is a little bit off, where at the beginning it's not entirely clear who we're supposed to be following, who's the good guy, who's the villain, and the main villain is introduced through exposition and then just kind of shows up through a mask reveal later on in a way that was a little bit confusing to me both times that I watched the film. But in general, a movie that's decent enough, interesting enough to see a superhero movie in the early phases of the genre, in particular because it is directed by Wes Craven. It's more of an intrigue for me than a movie that I would naturally gravitate to rewatch generically on its own, but one I'm glad I've seen. Coming in at number 27 is Red. This goofy action comedy is fun but forgettable. The big appeal here is seeing all of these fantastic actors and actresses playing these over-the-top characters. They're all having a ton of fun, so the audience is having fun with them. But it's also the kind of movie where you remember the premise, the energy, the vibe, more so than specific plot points. Like, I watched the movie less than 2 weeks ago, and I don't really remember what the plot was or what exactly was going on. Part of the reason for that is there's also way too much going on, way too many subplots, way too many comedic subplots where they're just trying to squeeze more actors into the movie, so it gets a little bit convoluted. But some of that doesn't matter. The movie just exists to entertain. Not every joke lands, but they're all played with so much energy that it's charming nonetheless. It's a movie that if it's ever on, I wouldn't mind rewatching it, but it's not a movie that I remember to rewatch on its own. Number 26, Superman Returns. For nearly 20 years, they were attempting to make a fifth Superman movie. Most notably, in the late 90s, Tim Burton was going to make a movie called Superman Lives that was going to star Nicolas Cage.
What was wrong with the original costume was that he wore his underpants on the outside.
Then a few years later, there was a different version called Superman Flyby that J.J. Abrams wrote. All of that fell through, and instead, they brought on Bryan Singer, the director of X-Men 1 and 2, to make Superman Returns, which was kind of a quasi-sequel to Superman 1 and 2, but that ignored Superman's 3 and 4. The end result is occasionally great, but it's largely a misguided attempt to make an homage to a bygone era of comic book movies. This really is Bryan Singer's love letter to Richard Donner's Superman films, and in doing so, there's a certain elegance to the way the movie is directed. He absolutely nails the energy and the vibe of Superman 1 and 2. A couple of the action sequences are great, in particular the plane rescue sequence. But at the same time, it just feels like a movie 20 years too late. Superman in the comics, as well as in TV shows, had moved beyond this old-fashioned version of Superman and Lex Luthor. So when you have Lex Luthor as this villain who's super goofy, campy, and wants to do a bunch of real estate schemes, it just feels ancient by the time this movie came out. Beyond that, there's not nearly enough action in the film. Beyond a couple of cool sequences, a bunch of what Superman even does is very dull, including in the climax of the movie, involves Superman just picking up an island while looking distressed, which is not a great way to have a big, exciting finale to your film. In the end, it's a very polished, slick production that's very respectful to past Superman films, but it was the wrong idea to execute at the time and simply didn't have enough action. Then we have The Losers, another star-studded, energetic action film that a lot of people didn't realize was based off a DC property. Part of what makes this one fun is when this movie came out, actors like Chris Evans weren't household names yet. They were up-and-coming actors, but they hadn't risen to the level of stardom that they currently have been since joining the MCU. Now, this movie has charisma oozing out of it because everyone has so much on-screen presence that they're just fun to watch. It's a lively movie with a bunch of lively characters, and that's kind of what elevates a movie that can feel very familiar. The basic plot and setup here seems like an alternate version of the A-Team. Likewise, there's a couple problems in the tone, whereas the setup for the film involves a bunch of kids getting murdered, but then it's also a very jokey, light film, and I don't think the two tones quite mesh entirely. Likewise, there's a third act twist involving Idris Elba's character that felt like it kind of came out of nowhere with how sharply his character turns. And so it's a movie that's very watchable. There's a lot of enjoyment to be had, but there are a number of problems with the script and the tone itself. Number 24, The Dark Knight Rises, the epic conclusion to Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, certainly has lofty ambitions. There's some very interesting versions of these characters with some great performances.
Of course.
But I also think this is one of Christopher Nolan's most deeply flawed films. In order to tell a story as big and epic as Nolan was aiming for, he had to make certain sloppy mistakes in the script and storytelling that his movies are normally known for not making. There's also certain repeated plot points in the film where Batman becomes Batman only to have his back broken so he can become Batman again. There's just too many loose ends, contrivances, and shortcuts in order to pull the whole thing together. And what makes this so frustrating is that the great moments are just as great as in the previous two films. There's heartbreaking moments with Alfred between him and Bruce, or Alfred at Bruce's grave in the final moments. In general, the way it builds up and swells in the final moments absolutely works for me. But Nolan had to cheat a little bit to get there, and that's what's disappointing about this film. I want to like it more, I want to be able to engage with it more, but I think there's a few too many mistakes. Moving along, we have Batman Returns. With his second Batman film, Burton decided to double down on all the Burtonisms, in which case you get a movie that stands out as very distinct inside of the comic book movie genre, but I think it works better as a Tim Burton superhero movie than as a Batman story. Burton reinterprets Batman, Penguin, and Catwoman as these freaks and loners that actually have quite a few similarities, but it manifests themselves in different ways. In doing so, there's some interesting themes being explored here. Both Danny DeVito and Michelle Pfeiffer give just amazing standout performances. Danny Elfman's score is phenomenal. The production design stands out. It's interesting. It's fun to look at. But it's the story itself that I'm not sure entirely works here, where the central plot line involves Penguin coming up with this master plan where he's going to run for mayor, but when that doesn't work out, he plans to kill all the children. And it just doesn't fully come together. It just feels like it's trying to do too many things in under 2 hours. Likewise, much like Burton's first Batman film, Batman's not really the star of his own movie or the character that Burton seems most interested in.
Not a great plan.
So while there are some great elements here, and this movie was a big part of my childhood, it's not one that I rewatch a lot as an adult. Number 22, Constantine. Now, this is a movie I watched for the very first time just a couple of weeks back, and it's a nice little mix of noir, comic book movie action, and demons. What really sold this one for me is the world building and some of the designs that they went with. As you kind of see Constantine go into hell and explore that environment, I just thought it was done really nicely, and certain effects shots were pulled off in a way that I just thought looked very cool. On the flip side, Keanu Reeves seems horribly miscast as Constantine. Whoa. And I didn't like Keanu Reeves, and he's great in movies like this. He's just not this specific character. Likewise, it's a movie that I don't feel like it knew exactly how to pay off everything that it was doing. So the third act was actually my least favorite part of the movie because I didn't feel like they did proper villain setup, and all these characters just seemed to like show up at the end in a way that wasn't very satisfying and didn't pay off all that well for me. So it's a movie that I liked the journey, the world building, and the vibe more than the specific story itself. Next up, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, the Ultimate Edition. Had I gone with the theatrical cut for this list, it would have been much lower because that version is fairly incoherent. Zack Snyder's follow-up to Man of Steel is one of the most divisive superhero films of all time because some people think it is absolutely atrocious and pretentious, and other people absolutely love it. As for me, it's a movie that I have always enjoyed while finding it to be very flawed at the same time. What I really enjoy about the film is that it actually is trying to explore ideas of what would the emergence of Superman in the world, how would different people respond to that? Some people would view him as a savior, others would be threatened by him, thus the plot of this movie. But because it's trying to explore those themes as a follow-up to Man of Steel while being a Batman v Superman movie and doing the death of Superman and bringing Lex Luthor into the mix and setting up Justice League, there's just too much going on in a single film, and it has to get very convoluted to pull all of it together.
You've made a huge mistake.
And it's frustrating to me because there's so many scenes, sequences, or action bits that I just think are awesome, but the plot holding it all together is not as strong as it should be. Certainly, the good outweighs the bad here for me by quite a bit. But they were so close to brilliance and they didn't quite get there. We've made it to the top 20 with Teen Titans Go to the Movie. It's irreverent, immature, obnoxious, and a lot funnier than I was expecting. To state the obvious, this movie is not going to be for everyone. It will either annoy you or entertain you. And in my case, it entertained me quite a bit. From its send-ups of the comic book movie genre as well as the industry surrounding them, to the ultra-violent time travel sequence, to the many musical numbers, one of which includes Michael Bolton. It's an upbeat inspire. Its comedy worked for me. It just landed. To be clear, this is a movie I went into assuming I wasn't going to like it. And I found myself laughing from beginning to end. But if you give it a chance, if you can tolerate the insanity, it's a lot wittier than it has any business being. Number 19, Tim Burton's Batman, an iconic comic book movie that revitalized the genre and sparked my love for comic book movies. In fact, I still have my Batman trading cards right here. Danny Elfman's score is one of the best superhero themes of all time. The production design is cool looking and distinct and makes the movie absolutely pop and stand out. Jack Nicholson plays a very lively, classic version of the Joker. There's a lot here to love. Unfortunately, I think the aesthetics and casting are far better than the story and the storytelling. First off, the movie doesn't seem very interested in Batman or Bruce Wayne. He doesn't really join the story until about 30 minutes into the film, and Jack Nicholson's Joker certainly takes center stage. Second, the way the actual scenes and sequences play out are very episodic, where it's just kind of cutting between all of these little misadventures of the Joker, and they don't necessarily tie together or build forward momentum. It's almost as if there's some missing pieces. And then Vicky Vale is a character that is written in a very odd fashion. As a love interest, there's nothing really there. They have one date, hook up with each other, and then Alfred lets her into the Batcave. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. The way she's included, when she's included, what happens. And so it's a movie that was so pivotal to my childhood, a movie that I watched roughly 1 billion times growing up. I don't know that it's aged all that well, though. Next up, Aquaman. Here, James Wan embraced the silliness of the character, and in doing so, made one of the most fun movies in the DCEU. It moves at breakneck speed from an origin story to a battle for a kingdom to a globe-trotting relic hunting film, and closes out with a big, gigantic war involving sea monsters. James Wan is looking to entertain, and he's cooking with butter and sugar. There's no shortage of pop music, cheesy one-liners, heroic poses, people eating goldfish, people eating flowers. Anything that's cheap entertainment, it goes for it. But it's entertainment nonetheless. I can see where this could be a bit fishy for some of you.
I thought my jokes were bad.
But for me, I found its energy infectious. A big part of why it works is that the cast are having a lot of fun and embracing how cartoonish the movie is. In particular, Jason Momoa is just all in with the humor, the action, all of it. Another couple of nice touches here. James Wan shoots the action with wide angle shots and long takes so you can see what's taking place. And it's also a movie that has an actual big story unfolding about this kingdom with family heritages, betrayals. There's a bunch of kind of Shakespearean stuff thrown in there. It can be goofy, it can be campy, but it's entertaining. Number 17, V for Vendetta, a fascinating character study whose political themes are just as relevant today as they were 15 years ago when the movie came out, as well as when the graphic novel was written. In fact, some of this movie's kind of eerie when you're watching it in the year 2021 and a bunch of crises faced in the film mirror a bunch of stuff that's happened over the last year and a half. Hugo Weaving is great in the film and he has a bunch of poetic dialogue that's so eloquently delivered.
Words will always retain their power. Words are for the means to meaning, and for those who will listen, the enunciation of truth.
The movie's a little bit more political thriller than action film. It's very much about this criminal investigation in intrigue. But when the action does happen, you can tell that the Wachowskis were involved in this production because it has their flair for visual spectacle. With that said, though, it feels like the mix of action is a little bit off because when it happens, it's so distinct and stands out so much that it feels like you either needed more action in the film or probably not such flashy action because it draws too much attention to itself. It's also a movie that feels like they squished 4 hours of plot into 2 hours. Now, they did a good job of squishing all the plot into 2 hours, but you can tell at certain points in time they're trying to rush through all the different pieces and putting the dominoes in place so they can tip them over in the finale. It's also a movie for me that gets better as it goes along. It doesn't immediately capture me, but as I get to know the characters, as it sets all the pieces up, the payoff is rather nice in the last 20 minutes. At number 16, the Lego Batman movie. The Lego take on Batman turns out to be actually a very good take on the character. Superficially, it's just as wild and hyperactive as the other Lego movies. It is jam-packed with Warner Brothers properties with a bunch of cameos from all kinds of different franchises, but at its core, it's a very heartfelt Batman story. It understands the loneliness and contradictions of Bruce Wayne. It plays them for laughs, but it can also be very poignant at other points in time. Will Arnett is absolutely fantastic as this exaggerated version of the Caped Crusader, but across the board, the voice cast here are a ton of fun. The movie can be a little bit much for me because there's so much going on. There's so many laughs. There's so many heartfelt moments. There's so many cameos that it can be a little bit of sensory overload, but it's a great example of how to tell a wild story that both sends up and celebrates its lead character. Number 15, Birds of Prey and the Unbelievably Long Title. Now, this is a movie that's a lot more polarizing than I was expecting. If it's not your cup of tea, fair enough, but I've never really understood just how much hate the internet throws at this movie. Now, I went into it expecting to not like it all that much because the trailers didn't really win me over, but the movie itself felt kind of like a smaller scale, street level crime story set in the world of DC, directed by Guy Ritchie, and that's interesting to me. Most importantly, it features cocaine.
I do cocaine! Cocaine's a hell of a drug.
Since the story's being told by Harley Quinn, you have an unreliable narrator who's telling everything with a bit of extra flair going into it. It's non-linear, it's hyperactive, and one of the nice touches is that they brought in the stunt team from the John Wick movies to enhance a couple of the action sequences. So in particular, the prison sequences are very cool. There's a chase at the end with Harley Quinn on roller skates with a car, and it's practical stunt work rather than a bunch of big CGI spectacle. And so it's a movie that far exceeded my expectations and a movie that I still don't don't understand quite why everyone hates it. Number 14, A History of Violence, another movie that a lot of people don't realize is based off of a DC property, and a movie that I had never seen until last week. It was actually the last movie I watched while prepping for this video series, and it was such a pleasant surprise. It's kind of this slow burn thriller with these bursts of ultra-violence. Tells the story of this mild-mannered diner owner in this small town who kills a couple of people in self-defense who are robbing his diner, and this just causes people to start looking into his past as to how he would be able to do this. And it's a great character study, amazing acting from beginning to end. It's not a big, flashy film. It's just a solid, slow burn action thriller. If you're into these kinds of things and haven't seen this one, definitely check it out. Next up, Shazam. 1 part superhero movie, 1 part big, and 1 part family drama, and all of it kind of works. Zachary Levi is absolutely perfect as this man-child superhero. He has a childish innocence and mischievousness to the way he's able to perform these scenes so that you believe that's the brain of a child in this adult's body. But what I think elevates this film is that when he's not Shazam, when he's back with the family at the house, those moments work just as well. It's a movie that legitimately has a heart to it where you care about the characters, the journey that he's on, and it's absolutely heartbreaking when he finds his real mother and she essentially rejects him and realizes that he didn't get lost, she abandoned him. There's a couple of problems in here. The tone gets a bit too dark in certain sequences, in particular where demons start biting people's heads off, and if that hadn't been the case, this one might have even been higher up on the list, but it's funny. It's got a great lead character, and it has a heart. Number 12, Wonder Woman. When I first heard that they were attempting to make a movie out of an Amazonian superhero who flies around in an invisible jet and swings around with a magic lasso and dresses in an outfit that looks like a skimpy version of the US flag turned into a bathing suit, I had no clue how they could pull that off without being too campy. And the second film kind of affirmed my fears. 10 years ago, even Joss Whedon had attempted to make his own version, and he couldn't crack the code. But Patty Jenkins managed to crack the code and tell a story that has thrilling, stylized action, an awesome score, a witty sense of humor, great chemistry between the leads, and kind of explores some ideas about man's inhumanity to man. The glue holding it all together is Gal Gadot, who just has this wonderful sense of strength and innocence at the same time. You totally buy into her confidence as she heads forth into battle, but at the same time, she can play the fish out of water humor perfectly as she's naive to the normal world. Beyond that, she's got great chemistry with Chris Pine. You buy into their relationship, their love story, their admiration for one another, and there's a lot of humor between them as well. Once again, this is one that might have been higher up on the list, except the third act kind of drops the ball just a little bit. It gets very talky when you want things to get more exciting, and when the exciting stuff does happen, it's just kind of like big CGI generic fight once again. Apparently, Patty Jenkins' original version of the finale would have played out differently, but the WB wanted her to have something flashier, so we got something kind of generic at the end. In general, a movie that was so much better than I was expecting it to be, and a win on almost every level, except fully sticking the landing. Number 11, The Road to Perdition. After winning a whole bunch of Oscars for American Beauty, Sam Mendes decided to follow it up by adapting a graphic novel from a DC imprint called The Road to Perdition. The end result was an absolutely gorgeous period piece crime thriller starring Tom Hanks and a bunch of other familiar faces. It almost goes without saying, but the acting here from beginning to end is just absolutely top-notch. The cinematography is amazing. Sam Mendes intentionally wanted to tell a story through images rather than being dialogue heavy, and that's what he does here. And what makes it so profound is that it's such an intricately crafted story while being simplistic in another sense. The characters have these long histories with one another. They have deep ties to all these organizations, and so the story is about the unfolding of what if one piece and one cog broke in the system and it all started to collapse because of it. But the characters aren't cardboard cutouts. They're not simplistic. They both will have malice for someone while having deep love for them at the exact same time. And it makes every interaction so deep, so fascinating, without needing to spell all of it out. There's a few issues here with the pacing. It takes like 45 minutes for the plot to fully kick in, and then it kind of quickly rushes through some of the more exciting things that happen in the middle. But in general, a great little crime thriller with deep themes about father-son relationships, the consequences of violence, and a movie worth checking out. Bringing us into the top 10, The Suicide Squad. After Disney decided to fire James Gunn over some tweets from over 10 years ago, WB snatched him up and set him loose to make whatever superhero he wanted to make, and the end result was an ultra-violent, wickedly funny version of The Suicide Squad. This is a movie that highlights James Gunn's strengths. He's very good at putting together these ensembles of outcasts and weirdos and forming a family out of them, telling a story filled with bizarre, strange characters, some of them very cartoonish, some of them barely speak any English, and somehow he finds the heart inside of it, so you actually care about the characters, but you also care about the group dynamic as a whole. Even as some of them is just morally repugnant as they are, you like them. They're endearing in their own ways. James Gunn also has a wickedly funny, dark sense of humor that fits much better in an R-rated Suicide Squad movie than it does working for Mickey Mouse. So here you get a bunch of ultra-violence, dark humor, heroes that do grotesque things on accident, and the movie just kind of shrugs it off. And if you like dark humor, there's plenty of it on display here. But where the movie really succeeds is it knows how to give each character emotional payoff. Whether it's a character who was experimented on by his mother to be a superhero and giving payoff to that journey, or Harley Quinn running off with a javelin and finding a very gross way to pay that off, or a father and his daughter who can't get along, but through the journey of this film, he earns his daughter's respect. There's so much satisfaction in the way that this movie ends. So it's got humor, it's got heart, it's absolutely ridiculous, and it's highly entertaining. Number 9, Superman 2, the theatrical and Richard Donner cuts. If you're not familiar with the backstory behind this movie, originally Superman 1 and 2 were being shot at the exact same time with Richard Donner as the director, but because they were going over budget and over schedule, they decided to stop shooting Superman 2 and just put all their effort into finishing Superman 1. When that was a massive hit and they greenlit Superman 2, the producers and Richard Donner were on very bad terms, and either they fired him or he decided not to return, so they brought in a different director to finish the movie. But in order to be able to give a director credit for directing a film, they have to shoot over 50% of the film, so they had to reshoot a big gigantic chunk of Superman 2 in order for the director that finished Superman 2 to get credit for the film. And then 25 years later on DVD, they released Richard Donner's cut of the movie as best they could, since he didn't actually fully finish his version, so we have two different versions of this film. Now, had Richard Donner been able to truly complete his version of the film, I think it's safe to say that would have been the better version, but as is, I think each version has its flaws. But the idea of this movie is the perfect follow-up to Superman the movie. The physical threat is raised, the stakes are raised, because Superman has to face 3 different Kryptonians who want to take over the Earth. But on a personal level, Superman is deciding, does he want to be the hero Superman or the man Clark Kent and pursue love? So it just continues all of the story arcs of the first film while ratcheting up the tension, the emotion, and complementing the original so nicely. Unfortunately, Richard Donner couldn't properly complete his vision, so they brought in a director that doesn't really understand Superman and his powers, so the theatrical cut has a bunch of slapstick humor thrown into it, some wacky powers thrown into the third act, and with the Richard Donner cut, it recycles the ending of the first movie where Superman turns back time by spinning around the Earth, and some of it is test footage, so it's just not a complete film in a lot of ways. So a version that I wish I could put higher because I love this movie so much, but we have two flawed versions. Next up, Watchmen, Zack Snyder's adaptation of the most celebrated graphic novel of all time. At its core, it's a deconstruction of superhero stories and exploring the realities of what if people this powerful actually existed in the real world. If they were given autonomy to do whatever they wanted, how would that actually play out? What would the consequences of that be? And in doing so, tells this story where good and bad aren't exactly entirely clear. It's not easy to determine exactly what our heroes should and shouldn't do. And some of the people we're rooting for are pretty awful and do horrific, brutal things. And some of the people that are the actual villains are doing it for noble causes. It adds complexity to all of the characters, a relatability to everyone at the exact same time. Now, of course, Zack Snyder has a ability to adapt the imagery to the big screen. Some of Snyderisms might be a little bit too on display here with the use of the slow-mo and his favorite songs being strewn throughout the film. In particular, it's a little bit weird when Tom Waits is the background music for a sex scene. But all in all, an interesting, complex, epic superhero story that doesn't play into any of the tropes of the genre. It's also a movie that's very difficult to translate from the comics to the big screen because Alan Moore designed it to be consumed and the story to unfold through the nature in which specifically comic books are read, and that's led to there being three very different cuts of the film, one of them even involving an animated segment cut all throughout the entire film. A bunch of high-profile directors had actually been trying to adapt it to the big screen for 20 years before this movie came out. But in general, this is an epic superhero story that doesn't play neatly into any of the tropes of the genre, doesn't have any of the safe payoffs that you would expect, largely because it's pulling from some of the best source material and from a director with a nice visual flair. Number 7, Batman Mask of the Phantasm, the theatrical version of my favorite animated TV show of all time, as well as a Batman origin story over 10 years before Batman Begins came out. If you're familiar with your channel, you know I love origin stories. I absolutely love Batman. So when you take my favorite animated TV show of all time, the character of Batman, and make it an origin story, you're giving me everything that I absolutely love. It's a great study of Bruce Wayne and what makes him tick, the many directions that he's being pulled as a person. It manages to explore Bruce Wayne and what makes him tick, the many values that he has, and the fact that he's a real person that can be tempted away from his mission, and what would that look like. It manages to bring us a new villain while also incorporating in characters like the Joker. It gives Bruce Wayne a romance that you can buy into that fits into our understanding of who Bruce Wayne is and how he would respond to actually finding love and happiness. On just a story level, I think there's an effective enough mystery about Andrea, her backstory, what was going on in the past, what's going on in the present, how does she tie into the Phantasm who's committing all these crimes in the city. Beyond that, the designs, the music of Batman, the animated series were fantastic. Here, they're given a bigger budget, so they look even better, and the music sounds even more grand and orchestrated. And of course, for me, this is the definitive version of Batman as well as the Joker. When this movie came out, almost no one went went to go see it in the theater, except my sister and I opening weekend, and I've loved it ever since. Next up, Man of Steel, Zack Snyder's reimagining of Superman for the 21st century. This is a movie that took me a while to fully appreciate. In fact, had I done this ranking when the movie first came out, it would have been much lower down on the list because it took me a while to fully understand and appreciate the story that he was telling about Kal-El, Clark Kent, the person, and the themes being explored. At its core, it has so many more primal human emotions than people give it credit for. It starts off with a mother and father having to send off their child. You have Pa Kent having to raise this incredibly powerful child and not knowing the right thing to do. You have Clark learning from Jor-El that his name is Kal, and he just has so much joy in simply knowing his name. There's all these little details throughout the film that are so human that people miss because of the Snyderisms. Certainly on a superficial level, the movie abandons a bunch of the traditional Superman imagery and scenarios, but at its heart, it's trying to treat Superman as if he was a real person that arrived on Earth, and what would that person go through, especially at the point in time that he would choose to reveal himself, and what would cause him to do that. Henry Cavill is absolutely great in the role. Of course, he can pull off the physicality of the role, but beyond that, you believe that he's this person that's always the most powerful person in the room and has to hide it from everyone around him at every moment. And finally, Hans Zimmer might be the top composer of the last 20 years, and I would argue this is his best score of all time. It elevates every single scene and perfectly fits the character as well as the movie, while not in any way trying to mirror what John Williams did over 40 years ago. When you put it all together, it's a fresh new take on a familiar character with a great lead performance, a director with an amazing visual flair, and a phenomenal score. It's a movie that every time I watch it, I like it even more. In fifth place, Batman Begins. After wowing the executives at the WB with Memento as well as Insomnia, they trusted him to revitalize the Batman franchise after Batman and Robin had tanked it for 7 years. And the end result for me is one of the best superhero movies of all time. And beyond that, a personal favorite superhero movie. I absolutely love origin stories, stories of becoming, and this is one of the absolute best ones because it's not about someone with superpowers. It's about a person with a mission and a purpose that dedicates all of their energy and their resources to going on this quest to becoming something different. And in the hands of Christopher Nolan, it's creative in how the story is told, and emotional in how it pays off. Top to bottom, the cast here is absolutely phenomenal. They took Christian Bale, who was one of these actors that everyone in Hollywood knew who he was, but he wasn't an A-lister yet, and just propelled him instantly to the A-list where he's remained ever since. It's a movie that takes these characters and the genre seriously. It wants to explore what makes them tick and what would drive them to behave in this fashion, and it finds a bunch of ways to have all of these big payoffs. As soon as you start getting to the middle of the film, every 15 minutes, there's some potent moment of emotion all the way up into the finale when Rachel discovers who's behind the mask and what that means for her relationship with that person. So this is a movie I absolutely love. Number 4, Joker. At a time when the comic book movie genre was dominated by big spectacle films trying to outdo each other by going even bigger and more sensational, Todd Phillips decided to go in the opposite direction and tell a tragedy. A character study about a deeply broken man that the audience wants to see succeed, that wants to see him find his confidence and stop being bullied. But as you watch the story, you see he discovers that confidence through turning into a horrific monster, and it finds a way to both explore all of these ideas about society, about the treatment of the mentally unstable, while telling a compelling story. Top to bottom, the movie is jam-packed with phenomenal performances. Of course, Joaquin Phoenix is one of the top working actors today, and when you give him a character like this, he can just go to such dark and disturbing places, and he's someone willing to do that. Now, certainly in certain senses, this is Taxi Driver with a Joker skin around it, but that doesn't change the fact that it has things to say, it tells its story well, and everything about it is just simply top-notch from my perspective. And even that comparison to a classic film from 40 years ago is what makes this movie so fresh and different inside of this genre. Almost every comic book movie these days ends with a big, gigantic CGI fight and a skybeam. And instead, this movie decided to be a character study, exploring what drives a man crazy, and how society deals with people like that. Or doesn't deal with people like that. Real quick, before I give you my top 3, remember to join me down below in the comment section. Share your picks for the best DC movies of all time. My list is not the right list. It's just my list, and I would love to see yours. Also, a bunch of people are asking, what do I think about the mini animated DC movies? I actually did a ranking of the continuity that ran from Flashpoint Paradox to Justice League Dark Apocalypse War. You can check that video out right up here when this video is done, as well as my ranking of all the Marvel movies. Check them out up here once this video is done. In third place, Zack Snyder's Justice League, a movie that I never thought that we would see this complete of a version of this film. I thought that 15, 20 years from now, Warner Brothers would put out some release of it that kind of finishes where you could kind of see what happened, but instead, they gave Zack Snyder $70 million to truly complete this film, and in doing so, revealed just how big of an abomination Justice League was back in 2017. Every single thing about this version of the film is better than that version of the film, and in fact, most every single change they made the movie dramatically worse in embarrassing ways. I cannot fathom who thought that they should take Flash running into an explosion, turning back time to save mankind, and let's cut that out and instead replace it with, what if the Flash pushes a car as the setup for a joke about Superman being better than him? I can't fathom how anyone would think that would be a remotely good idea. Anyway, sorry. I got worked up talking about Justice League. This is Zack Snyder's magnum opus, the movie where he got to tell a big, epic story that takes its time to set up each of the characters, each of the plot points, and then slowly develops them, slowly adds complications so you understand everything taking place, how all the characters interact with one another, why they matter. The conflict in each scene is developed, fleshed out, so every piece matters in the story. So as you start moving into the second half, all the payoff is so rich, it's so satisfying because the movie was able to do the hard work of earning the moments that happen for the whole last, in the case of this movie, 2 hours of runtime. This is how you do a serious, dark, comic book movie epic properly. Our runner-up, Superman the movie, the godfather of the comic book movie genre, had its story originally written by the author of The Godfather. While there certainly were comic book movies that came out before Superman the movie, this is the first time that a producer said, let's do a big budget, serious adaptation of a comic book, and the end result changed the genre forever, and in fact created the template that is being copied by everyone to this day. According to Kevin Feige, before making any MCU films, he re-watches Superman the movie. Certainly, if you watch this movie for the very first time in 2021, the 43-year-old special effects are dated. Some of the humor, too campy. But if you compare this movie to the genre before it was created, it's an incredible triumph, especially if you look at the first 50 minutes as Richard Donner tells the epic story of the fall of Krypton, the upbringing of Clark Kent, and the transformation to Superman. It's treated with such reverence and respect. Christopher Reeves absolutely perfect in the lead role, where you can believe that people would buy him as this nerdy Clark Kent, and then as the strong, confident Superman. He just transforms between the two performances. I am not exaggerating when I say this is the movie that's responsible for all comic book movies that have come since. Traditionally, in past videos, I have put this one in the #1 spot. It's just a personal favorite. It is #1. It is that important to me on a personal level. It is the movie that I grew up with. But if I'm being fair, and I'm leveling criticisms against these movies the way I've leveled against other movies that I grew up with, there are some things with the stories. Superman does turn back time by flying around the earth, so I decided I would bring it down just one spot. But in first place is The Dark Knight, Christopher Nolan's superhero epic that draws just as much from the comics such as The Long Halloween as it does from crime thrillers such as Heat, and in doing so creates something truly unique inside of the genre. From beginning to end, Nolan has crafted a thriller that has you at the edge of your seat. Whether you're talking about the scenes in and of themselves that manage to find conflict and tension, or the momentum of the story as a whole, it's just constantly winding up the tension, building up the conflict, so the ending pays off so well without it needing to be all about spectacle, because you care about the characters, you care about the city, and Nolan has made you care about the story itself. On a production level, Gotham looks bigger than ever because Nolan decided to go to an actual city, shoot with these IMAX cameras, and in doing so, it just makes it feel like a lived-in real place that you can go to. Now, of course, the standout performance that everyone talks about is Heath Ledger as the Joker, that finds a way to be terrifying, but sometimes still funny at the same time, especially when doing magic tricks. But I also think Aaron Eckhart gives a great performance as Harvey as well as Two-Face. The movie's a triumph on almost every single level. It has the exciting action that you want from a comic book movie, while also just telling a great story about characters that you care about, and it manages to pull them all together into this stirring and swelling finale in the final moments that pays off the whole thing so well. There's a reason that people have been celebrating this as the greatest comic book movie of all time ever since it came out over 10 years ago. Because it's that good. Therefore, it comes in at #1. If you enjoyed this video, I've got more like it. You can see my ranking of those DC animated films right over there, and my ranking of all 58 Marvel movies right down below me. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.